The human exploration vessel Wanderer moved through the darkness of space like a silent ghost, its hull reflecting the distant stars as it conducted another routine survey of the Kepler 442 system. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair, reviewing the daily reports from his crew with the kind of bored efficiency that came from 3 months of finding absolutely nothing interesting. They had cataloged 17 planets, none of them particularly special, and Jake was already thinking about the coffee waiting for him in his quarters when the communications console suddenly erupted with noise. Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez jerked upright in her seat, her hands flying across the controls as she tried to isolate the signal. The bridge crew turned to look at her, curiosity replacing the usual drowsiness of gamma shift. Maya's eyes went wide as she processed what she was hearing, and she quickly routed the audio through the main speakers so everyone could listen. The voice that filled the bridge spoke in heavily accented English, each word pronounced with the careful precision of someone using a translation algorithm that wasn't quite up to the task. The speaker identified himself as Ambassador Zexoth of the Vortan Empire, representative of the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known. He spoke of conquest and glory, of 10,000 worlds bowing before the might of his people, of fleets that had crushed every resistance they had ever encountered across 12,000 cycles of expansion. Jake listened with increasing confusion as the ambassador continued his speech, detailing the various weapons systems the Vortan Empire possessed and the futility of any resistance. The translation software struggled with some of the technical terms, but the general message was clear enough. The Vortans were demanding immediate and total surrender from the human vessel, and all of humanity beyond it. They had one standard cycle to comply, whatever that meant, or face complete annihilation. The bridge remained silent as the transmission ended, everyone processing what they had just heard. Jake looked around at his crew, seeing his own bewilderment reflected in their faces. Chief Engineer Leo Patterson was the first to break, a small snort escaping before he could stop it. That single sound was like a crack in a dam, and suddenly the entire bridge crew was laughing. Maya doubled over her console, gasping for breath between fits of giggles. Navigator Claire Bennett had tears streaming down her face as she tried and failed to compose herself. Even the usually serious tactical officer Greg Hamilton was grinning like an idiot, shaking his head in disbelief. Leo actually fell out of his chair, landing on the deck with a thud that only made everyone laugh harder. Jake tried to maintain some semblance of command dignity, but he could feel his own composure crumbling. The absurdity of the situation was just too much. Here they were, a single exploration ship conducting mineral surveys in an uninhabited system, and some alien empire had just demanded their surrender with all the dramatic flair of a bad action movie villain. The communications console beeped again, and Maya managed to pull herself together enough to open the channel. Ambassador Zexoth's face appeared on the main view screen, his features distinctly alien but somehow managing to convey obvious confusion. He had multiple eye stalks that swiveled independently, skin that looked like polished bronze, and elaborate robes that probably cost more than Jake's entire year's salary. The ambassador clearly expected fear, or at least respect, and the sound of human laughter had thrown him completely off script. Zexoth repeated his demands, this time with more emphasis and additional details about the Vortan military machine. He spoke of battle cruisers that could glass entire planets, of warrior castes bred specifically for combat, of psychological conditioning that made Vortan soldiers fearless in battle. He listed the names of species that had fallen before them, civilizations that had tried to resist and been utterly destroyed. This only made the humans laugh harder. Claire was now leaning against her console for support, her shoulders shaking. Danny Wright, the communications officer who had been silent until now, was making strange wheezing sounds as he tried to breathe through his laughter. Even the 2 security officers stationed at the back of the bridge had abandoned any pretense of professionalism. Jake finally managed to get himself under control. Wiping his eyes and taking several deep breaths, he stood up from his command chair and walked closer to the view screen, studying the increasingly agitated alien ambassador. Zexoth's eye stalks were waving in what looked like frustration, and his bronze skin had taken on a slightly darker hue that might have been the Vortan equivalent of blushing. The captain raised one hand to quiet his crew, though sporadic giggles continued to bubble up here and there. He cleared his throat and tried to adopt a more diplomatic tone. even though he could feel another laugh trying to escape. When he spoke, he kept his voice as level as possible, but there was no hiding the amusement that colored every word. Jake asked the ambassador a simple question, one that had been nagging at him since the transmission began. He wanted to know exactly how long the Vortan Empire had been expanding through the galaxy. Zexoth seemed surprised by the question, but answered proudly that the Empire had been growing for 12,000 cycles, adding new worlds to their domain at a steady pace that demonstrated their superior military and organizational capabilities. The captain nodded slowly and asked another question. How many worlds had they conquered in those 12,000 cycles? The ambassador's chest swelled with pride as he declared that the Vortan Empire now controlled 10,000 planets, each one a jewel in their magnificent collection of subjugated civilizations. Jake turned to look at his science officer, Sophie Turner, who had been quietly running calculations at her station throughout the entire exchange. Sophie was a small woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she had the kind of sharp analytical mind that made her invaluable on survey missions. She caught Jake's glance and nodded, her own lips twitching with suppressed amusement as she began pulling up data on her console. The captain gestured for her to share her findings with the rest of the bridge, and Sophie transferred her display to the main view screen, replacing the confused ambassador's face with a holographic representation of the Milky Way galaxy. The image rotated slowly, showing the familiar spiral arms and the dense core, with hundreds of billions of stars twinkling in the simulation. Sophie's voice was professionally neutral as she began to explain, but Jake could hear the laughter lurking just beneath the surface. She stated that current scientific estimates place the number of stars in the galaxy at approximately 400 billion, give or take 50 billion depending on which astronomer you asked. Of those stars, somewhere between 20 and 50% were likely to have planets in the habitable zone, meaning worlds where liquid water could exist and life might develop. She paused to let those numbers sink in before continuing. Even using the most conservative estimates, that meant there were at least 80 billion potentially habitable planets in the galaxy. The Vortan Empire, with their 10,000 conquered worlds, had claimed approximately 0.0000125% of those worlds. Danny Wright, who had finally stopped laughing long enough to breathe normally, did some quick mental math and announced that at their current rate of expansion, the Vortans would need approximately 960 million years to conquer the entire galaxy, assuming no one else was out there competing for the same real estate. The bridge fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock or fear. It was the silence of people collectively realizing that they had just encountered something simultaneously threatening and utterly ridiculous. The Vortan Empire, for all its bluster and dramatic speeches, was apparently the galactic equivalent of the neighborhood kid who had beaten up 3 smaller children and declared himself king of the playground. Jake looked back at the view screen where Ambassador Zexoth's face had reappeared, the alien's expression now showing something that might have been uncertainty. The captain opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Leo started laughing again from his position on the floor, and the whole thing started over. Captain Jake Morrison finally managed to restore some order to his bridge crew, though occasional chuckles still escaped from various stations as people tried to focus on their work. Ambassador Zexoth remained on the view screen, his eye stalks now drooping slightly in what Jake was beginning to recognize as confusion mixed with wounded pride. The alien diplomat had clearly never encountered this kind of reaction before, and he seemed genuinely unsure how to proceed. Maya Rodriguez wiped the last tears from her eyes and turned back to her communications console, her professional demeanor slowly returning even though her shoulders still shook with residual laughter. She pulled up additional data from the Vortan transmission, analyzing the signal strength and point of origin. What she found made her pause, and she quickly shared her findings with the captain. The Vortan fleet, if it could be called that, consisted of exactly 7 ships currently in the outer system. Maya had isolated their energy signatures and compared them to the database of known propulsion system. As the results were not impressive, the Vortan vessels were using a form of faster-than-light travel that humanity had abandoned nearly a century ago because it was inefficient and painfully slow by modern standards. Danny Wright pulled up a tactical display showing the relative positions of the Vortan ships. They were arranged in what was probably meant to be an intimidating formation, But to anyone with even basic military training, it looked awkward and exposed. Greg Hamilton studied the formation for about 30 seconds before snorting and pointing out at least 4 obvious tactical weaknesses that any competent commander could exploit. Jake held up his hand to forestall any more commentary from his crew and turned his attention back to the ambassador. He decided that the situation called for diplomacy rather than mockery, even though the temptation to make jokes was almost overwhelming. The captain took a deep breath and asked Zexoth if they could discuss the situation. More calmly and rationally, the ambassador seemed relieved by the change in tone and immediately launched into another speech about the glory of the Vortan Empire. He spoke of their technological superiority and their manifest destiny to rule the stars. He described their home world as a paradise of advanced science and culture, where every citizen lived in comfort and security under the benevolent rule of the Imperial Council. Sophie Turner listened carefully to this description, her analytical mind picking apart the details even as Zexoth spoke. She began cross-referencing the information with humanity's extensive database of known civilizations, and quickly found several interesting discrepancies. The Vortan homeworld, according to their own ambassador, took 847 Earth days to complete a single orbit around its star. This revelation made Sophie sit up straighter in her chair. She interrupted the ambassador's speech with a polite question about their calendar system and how they measured time. Zexoth seemed puzzled by the question but answered readily enough. The Vortan Empire measured everything in cycles, with one cycle being equal to one complete orbit of their homeworld. Their empire had been expanding for 12,000 cycles, which they had already stated. Danny quickly pulled up a calculator and started doing the math while Sophie explained the problem to the rest of the bridge crew. If one Vortan cycle equaled 847 Earth days, then 12,000 cycles was actually about 27,800 Earth years. The ambassador had been using his own planetary year as a standard measurement, without realizing that other species might have completely different orbital periods. Claire Bennett started laughing again, but this time it was a quieter, more amazed kind of laughter. She pointed out that this meant the Vortan Empire had been expanding for almost 28,000 years, and had only managed to conquer 10,000 worlds. That worked out to roughly one conquest every 2.8 years, which was actually even slower than everyone had initially thought. Leo Patterson climbed back into his seat at the engineering station and pulled up humanity's colonization records for comparison. The numbers he found were startling even to him. Humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel 217 years ago, and in that relatively short time they had established permanent settlements on 47 different star systems. None of those settlements had required conquering anyone because the worlds had been uninhabited when humans arrived. The engineer shared these statistics with the rest of the bridge, and Jake watched as Ambassador Zexoth's expression shifted from pride to uncertainty. The alien was clearly intelligent enough to understand the implications of what he was hearing. His empire had been slowly bullying their way across a tiny section of space for thousands of years, while humanity had peacefully expanded much faster without firing a shot in anger. Jake decided to push the point a little further. He asked the ambassador about the civilizations the Vortans had conquered. What level of technology had those species possessed when the Empire arrived? Were they spacefaring races with their own starships and advanced weapons? Had any of them put up significant resistance? Zexoth's hesitation before answering told Jake everything he needed to know, but the ambassador eventually provided details that confirmed the captain's suspicions. Most of the conquered worlds had been at pre-industrial levels of development when the Vortans arrived. A few had achieved basic spaceflight, mostly primitive satellites and maybe a moon landing or two, but none of them had possessed faster-than-light capability or any real means of defending themselves against an invasion from space. The bridge crew exchanged glances as this information sank in. The Vortan Empire had built its entire identity around conquering civilizations that had no realistic way to fight back. They had shown up on worlds where the inhabitants were still using steam engines or early computers, demonstrated their superior technology, and demanded submission. When faced with what appeared to be gods descending from the heavens, most of these primitive societies had simply surrendered without a fight. Maya spoke up from her station, her voice thoughtful rather than mocking. She pointed out that humanity had encountered similar situations during their expansion into space. There were at least a dozen pre-spaceflight civilizations in the local sector that Earth's government had decided to leave alone, observing them from a distance but never making contact. The prevailing philosophy was that younger species deserved the chance to develop naturally without interference from more advanced neighbors. Sophie added that this non-interference policy was actually common among most spacefaring civilizations. There were even informal agreements between different species about respecting the development of primitive worlds. The fact that the Vortons had built their entire empire on exploiting such civilizations suggested they had been operating in relative isolation, never encountering anyone powerful enough to challenge their methods. Jake asked the ambassador directly if the Vortan Empire had ever encountered another spacefaring civilization with technology comparable to their own. Zexoth's silence stretched for several long seconds before he admitted that no, they had not. Every species they had met had been significantly less advanced, which the Vortans had interpreted as evidence of their own superiority and destiny to rule. The captain nodded slowly, understanding now why the ambassador had been so shocked by the human reaction. The Vortons had spent thousands of years as the biggest predator in a very small pond, never realizing that they were actually swimming in a vast ocean full of much larger creatures. They had mistaken isolation for dominance and built an entire culture around that misunderstanding. Claire brought up another point that had been bothering her. She asked about the Vortan definition of a standard cycle, the time limit they had given humanity to surrender. When pressed for clarification, Zexoth explained that one standard cycle was equal to one rotation of the Vortan homeworld, which lasted approximately 32 Earth hours. Danny started laughing again and pointed out that the ambassador had just given humanity a deadline of 32 hours to surrender their entire species. The absurdity of expecting any civilization to make such a momentous decision in barely more than a day added another layer of comedy to the whole situation. Jake leaned back in his command chair and studied the alien ambassador on the view screen. Zexoth no longer looked quite so confident or threatening. His eye stalks drooped even more, and his elaborate robe seemed less impressive now that everyone understood the truth behind the Vortan Empire's reputation. The captain felt a strange mixture of amusement and sympathy for this representative of a civilization that had no idea how small they really were in the grand scheme of the galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of dismissing the Vortan ambassador or treating this entire encounter as a joke to be forgotten, he decided that this situation called for genuine diplomacy and perhaps even kindness. He could see that Ambassador Zexoth was struggling with the realization that his entire worldview was being challenged. And Jake remembered enough history to know that such moments could go badly, if not handled carefully. The captain stood from his chair and straightened his uniform, adopting a more formal posture as he addressed the ambassador. He extended an invitation for Zexoth and a small delegation to come aboard the Wanderer for what he called a cultural exchange. Jake explained that perhaps both species could benefit from learning more about each other rather than making hasty decisions based on misunderstandings and incomplete information. Ambassador Zexoth seemed taken aback by the offer. His eye stalks waved in patterns that Jake was beginning to recognize as uncertainty mixed with curiosity. After a moment of visible internal debate, the ambassador accepted the invitation with as much dignity as he could muster. He said he would arrive with a security detail within 2 of their standard cycles, which Danny helpfully translated as about 64 Earth hours. Jake corrected him gently, suggesting they meet in 6 hours instead, which would give both sides time to prepare properly. Zexoth agreed to this revised timeline, and the communication channel closed. The bridge crew immediately began talking among themselves, some questioning whether inviting potentially hostile aliens aboard was wise, others excited about the prospect of making first contact with a new species under less threatening circumstances. Maya coordinated with the diplomatic corps officer who had been sleeping during Gamma shift, waking poor Lieutenant Helen Carter with news that she needed to prepare for an actual first contact situation. Greg began running security protocols and preparing his team to receive armed aliens without anyone getting nervous and doing something stupid. Sophie started compiling everything they knew about Vortan biology and culture, from the brief transmission. 6 hours later, Jake stood in the main docking bay with a small reception committee. Helen Carter had arrived with impressive speed, looking professional despite having been roused from sleep. She had even managed to put together a basic first contact package with information about humanity and Earth. Greg stood nearby with 4 security officers who were doing their best to look friendly rather than threatening. The Vortan shuttle docked with a series of loud clanks that made Leo wince from his position at the bay control station. The docking mechanism was crude compared to human standards, and the shuttle itself looked like it had been built by someone who valued decoration over function. When the airlock finally cycled open, Ambassador Zexoth emerged, followed by 6 warriors in elaborate armor. The Vortan warriors were impressive in their own way. They stood nearly 7 feet tall, their bronze skin covered with intricate patterns that might have been tattoos or natural markings. The armor they wore was clearly ceremonial, with flowing designs and precious metals inlaid in complex patterns. Each warrior carried a weapon that looked like a cross between a spear and an energy rifle. Though Jake suspected the actual combat effectiveness was questionable, Greg Hamilton stood at attention, but Jake could see his tactical officer's eye twitching slightly as he analyzed the Vortan military equipment. The security chief later confided that the armor had at least 15 critical weak points. The weapons appeared to have no safety mechanisms, and the formation the warriors maintained was better suited for a parade than actual combat. Jake stepped forward and extended his hand in the traditional human greeting, then remembered that Zexoth might not understand the gesture. The ambassador surprised him by reaching out with one of his multiple appendages and grasping Jake's hand firmly. Zexoth explained that his people had studied the transmission humanity had sent into space centuries ago, the one with the golden record, and had learned some human customs from it. The tour of the Wanderer began in the main corridor, and Jake watched as the Vortan delegation reacted to their surroundings. The ship was not particularly large by human standards, designed primarily for exploration rather than military operations, but it was clear that the technology on display was far beyond what the Vortans were accustomed to. The smooth walls embedded with data displays, the artificial gravity that required no rotation, the clean air circulation systems, all of it seemed to fascinate their guests. Sophie gave a presentation about human faster-than-light drive technology in one of the science labs. She kept the explanation simple, but it was obvious that the Vortans were struggling to follow along. Their own understanding of physics was not wrong exactly, just incomplete. They had discovered one method of traveling faster than light and assumed they had reached the pinnacle of technological achievement. The science officer demonstrated their quantum mapping system, showing how the Wanderer had charted over 17,000 star systems in detail during its 3-year mission. She pulled up 3-dimensional maps that showed planetary positions, resource distributions, gravitational anomalies, and potential hazards. Each system had been cataloged with enough precision that any human ship could navigate through them safely. Claire Bennett took over the presentation to show the navigation systems. She explained how human vessels used a network of quantum-entangled beacons to maintain real-time communication across vast distances. The Vortans had nothing comparable, relying instead on traditional radio transmissions that could take years to travel between their conquered worlds. Ambassador Zexoth asked how humanity had developed such advanced technology so quickly. Jake decided that honesty was the best policy, and explained that humans had not developed it all themselves. When Earth achieved faster-than-light travel and ventured out into the galaxy, they had encountered other spacefaring civilizations within the first decade. Some of these species were friendly and willing to share knowledge and technology. The captain led the delegation to the observation deck where they could look out at the stars through the transparent hull plating. He pulled up a holographic display showing the local sector of the galaxy. Different colored markers indicated various civilizations and their territories. The Vortan Empire appeared as a small blue cluster, while humanity's settlements and allied territories sprawled across a much larger area in green. Jake pointed out the various species that humanity had encountered and established relationships with over the past 2 centuries. There were the Centauri, an ancient race that had been exploring the galaxy for millennia and had helped humanity avoid several early mistakes. The Delta Collective was a group of 3 species that had evolved on planets in the same star system and had developed spaceflight together. The Kepler Federation was a loose alliance of a dozen species that focused on scientific research and cultural exchange. Zexoth's eye stalks drooped lower and lower as he realized the implications. His people had assumed they were alone in the galaxy, except for primitive species to conquer. The truth was that they had simply been isolated, expanding into a region of space that happened to be sparsely populated with advanced civilizations. They had mistaken good luck for superiority and built an empire on that flawed foundation. The most devastating moment came when Sophie displayed the membership roster of the Stellar Commonwealth, an organization that humanity had helped establish 50 years ago. It was not a government exactly, more like a mutual cooperation agreement between species that valued peace and shared prosperity. The roster showed 217 member species, each one contributing their unique knowledge and resources to the collective good. Danny Wright brought up the trade networks that connected these various civilizations. Ships from dozens of species traveled freely between systems, carrying goods, information, and passengers. There were established protocols for resolving disputes, agreements about respecting territorial boundaries, and collaborative research projects that pooled the knowledge of multiple civilizations. The galaxy was not an empty battlefield waiting to be conquered, but a thriving community that the Vortons had never known existed. The tour continued to the mess hall where the crew took their meals. Jake had arranged for the kitchen staff to prepare a special dinner, showcasing food from many different worlds. Chef Marcus Johnson took pride in explaining each dish, describing not just the ingredients but the cultures they came from. There was Centauri grain porridge seasoned with earth spices, Kepler fish prepared according to Delta cooking methods, and desserts that combined recipes from half a dozen different species. Ambassador Zexoth ate slowly, processing not just the food but everything he had learned. His warriors had set aside their weapons and were actually laughing with some of the human crew members, sharing stories through translation software. The tension that had filled the docking bay had evaporated, replaced by genuine curiosity and tentative friendship. Jake sat across from the ambassador and decided to address the elephant in the room. He asked Zexoth what the Vortan Empire would do now that they knew the truth about the galaxy. Ambassador Zexoth sat in silence for a long moment after Jake's question, his eye stalks moving in slow contemplative patterns. The mess hall had grown quieter as the Vortan delegation and human crew members sensed the weight of the conversation. Finally, the ambassador spoke in a voice that carried none of the bombastic confidence from his initial transmission. He admitted that he did not know what his people would do with this information, and that uncertainty terrified him more than any military threat could. The ambassador explained that the Vortan Empire's entire social structure was built around the concept of manifest destiny and inherent superiority. Every child was taught from birth that they belonged to the greatest civilization in existence, chosen by fate to bring order to the chaos of the galaxy. Their literature celebrated conquest, their art depicted glorious victories over lesser species, and their religion promised that one day they would rule everything under the stars. Jake listened carefully as Zexoth continued, describing how the warrior caste held the highest social position in Vortan society. Scientists and artists were respected, but soldiers were revered as the true embodiment of their culture's values. The Imperial Council consisted entirely of military leaders who had distinguished themselves in combat against primitive worlds. To suddenly learn that their entire civilization was built on a foundation of ignorance and bullying would shake Vortan society to its core. Helen Carter, the diplomatic officer, asked a gentle question about whether the Vortan people had ever questioned their role in the galaxy. Zexoth's response was both sad and revealing. He said that there had been philosophers and scientists who wondered about the ethics of conquering less advanced species, but such voices were quickly silenced. Dissent was considered weakness, and weakness had no place in the Empire. Sophie Turner leaned forward with interest and asked what happened to those dissenters. The ambassador's eye stalks drooped even lower as he explained that they were not killed or imprisoned in the traditional sense. Instead, they were sent to work on the most remote conquered worlds, administering primitive populations far from the glory of the Empire's core systems. It was considered a shameful exile, a fate worse than death for ambitious Vortans. Greg Hamilton made an observation that seemed to surprise everyone, including himself. He pointed out that this meant there were already Vortons out in their empire who understood that something was wrong with their system. These exiled administrators had probably spent years or decades working directly with the conquered species, seeing them as real people rather than abstract victories. They might actually be allies in helping the Vorton Empire transition to a more peaceful approach. Jake saw the wisdom in Greg's observation and turned back to Zexoth. He asked if these exiled administrators maintained any contact with each other, or if they had any influence despite their disgrace. The ambassador thought for a moment before admitting that they did communicate, forming an unofficial network of what the warrior caste dismissively called the Scattered Ones. They had no official power, but they managed many of the day-to-day operations of the conquered worlds. Maya Rodriguez had been quiet during most of the dinner, but now she spoke up with an idea. She suggested that perhaps the best way to introduce the truth to the Vorton Empire was not through the warrior caste or the Imperial Council, but through these scattered ones who already questioned their civilization's path. They had the administrative experience and the compassion necessary to guide their people toward a better future. The conversation was interrupted by a priority alert from the bridge. Claire Bennett's voice came over the intercom requesting that Captain Morrison return immediately. Jake excused himself and jogged to the bridge with Greg following close behind. When they arrived, they found Claire staring at the tactical display with an expression of mixed amusement and concern. The navigator explained that 12 more human ships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. They were part of the exploration fleet that the Wanderer belonged to, responding to a routine check-in that Jake had completely forgotten to send during all the excitement with the Vortans. The fleet commander was requesting an explanation for why the Wanderer had gone silent for several hours. Jake quickly sent a message explaining the situation and requesting that the fleet hold position while he continued negotiations with the Vorton delegation. The response came back within minutes, and the captain could practically hear the laughter through the text communication. Fleet Commander Victoria Hayes said she would bring the other ships in slowly to avoid spooking their guests, but she wanted a full report as soon as possible because this was the most entertaining thing that had happened all year. The captain returned to the mess hall with Greg and found the Vorton delegation engaged in animated conversation with several crew members. Ambassador Zexoth looked up as Jake entered, and something in the captain's expression must have conveyed that the situation had changed. The ambassador's eye stalk straightened with concern, clearly worried that the human military had arrived to punish his people's aggressive first contact. Jake decided that there was no point in trying to hide the truth. He invited everyone to return to the observation deck where they could see the new arrivals. The group made their way through the corridors, the Vorton warriors noticeably tenser than they had been earlier. When they reached the observation deck and looked out at the stars, they saw the 12 human vessels arranged in a loose formation that emphasized their size rather than any tactical advantage. The ships were impressive by any standard. Each one was larger than the Wanderer, and their designs varied based on their specific functions. There were survey vessels with massive sensor arrays, colony transports that could carry thousands of people and tons of equipment, research platforms bristling with specialized laboratories, and support ships loaded with supplies and repair facilities. None of them were warships in the traditional sense, but their sheer size and obvious technological sophistication made them intimidating nonetheless. Sophie pulled up detailed specifications for each vessel and displayed them on a holographic screen. She explained that this exploration fleet was one of 30 such groups currently operating in various sectors of the galaxy. Each group was semi-independent, reporting back to Earth Command but making most decisions on their own. Their mission was to chart unknown systems, make contact with new civilizations when appropriate, and establish the groundwork for potential colonies. Danny Wright added some context that made Ambassador Zexoth's eye stalks droop once again. He explained that these exploration fleets represented only a tiny fraction of humanity's space-based assets. Earth maintained a defense fleet of over 3,000 military vessels, though they were rarely used for actual combat. The various colony worlds had their own defense forces as well, bringing the total number of human ships to somewhere around 15,000. Leo Patterson pulled up images of some of Earth's actual military vessels, and the difference between them and the exploration ships was stark. The warships were sleek and purpose-built, with weapon systems that could disable or destroy targets from extreme ranges. They incorporated stealth technology that made them nearly invisible to most sensors, and their armor could withstand incredible punishment. Fortunately for the galaxy, Leo explained, these ships spent most of their time on patrol duty or helping with disaster relief operations. Claire brought up the galactic map again, but this time she zoomed out to show a much larger view. The Vortan Empire's territory looked even smaller from this perspective. She highlighted various other civilizations, some of them ancient races that had been exploring space for tens of thousands of years. Others were younger than humanity, but had grown rapidly through cooperation and trade rather than conquest. The navigator pointed out 6 major civilizations that each controlled territory larger than the Vortan Empire. She explained that these were generally considered the great powers of the galaxy, though the term was somewhat misleading because most of them focused on exploration and research rather than military dominance. Humanity was not quite at that level yet, but they were growing quickly and had excellent relationships with most of the established powers. Ambassador Zexoth asked a question that had clearly been bothering him. He wanted to know why none of these civilizations had ever contacted the Vortan Empire or tried to stop their conquest of primitive worlds. Jake exchanged glances with his senior officers before attempting to answer honestly. The captain explained that the galaxy was almost incomprehensibly vast, with hundreds of billions of stars spread across thousands of light years. Even with faster-than-light travel, it took time to explore and catalog everything. The Vortan Empire had been expanding into a relatively isolated region of space that few other civilizations had explored in detail. Their conquered worlds were so primitive that they had not developed any technology that could be detected from a distance. Sophie added that there were also ethical debates among spacefaring civilizations about when and how to intervene in the development of younger species. Some argued that more advanced civilizations had a responsibility to prevent exploitation, while others believed that every species needed to make its own mistakes and learn from them. The result was that situations like the Vortan Empire often went unnoticed until they naturally encountered someone powerful enough to challenge their assumptions. Helen. Carter brought the conversation back to practical matters. She asked Ambassador Zexoth what he thought would happen if he returned to his people and told them the truth about the galaxy. The ambassador's response was blunt and pessimistic. He said that the Imperial Council would likely declare him insane or accuse him of treason, and they might even order attacks on human vessels in a desperate attempt to prove their superiority. The observation deck fell, silent after Ambassador Zexoth's grim prediction about how his people might react to the truth. Jake Morrison stood with his arms crossed, thinking through the implications while his crew waited for him to respond. The situation had transformed from a comedy of errors into something far more serious, a potential crisis that could end in unnecessary violence if not handled carefully. Leo Patterson broke the silence with an unexpected suggestion. He pointed out that the Vortan ships were still using outdated faster-than-light drives that were inefficient and slow. What if humanity offered to help them upgrade their technology? It would accomplish 2 things at once, demonstrating goodwill while also giving human engine. Here's a legitimate reason to spend time with Vortan crews and gradually introduce them to the reality of the larger galactic community. Sophie Turner immediately saw the genius in Leo's proposal. She added that they could frame it as a technology exchange rather than charity. The Vortans must have developed some unique solutions to problems during their thousands of years in space. Even if their overall technology level was lower, there might be specific techniques or approaches that humans could learn from. It would give the Vortans something to feel proud about while opening their minds to new possibilities. Ambassador Zexoth looked skeptical, but intrigued. He asked why humans would want to help a civilization that had just threatened them with destruction. His confusion was genuine, as if the concept of helping a potential enemy was completely foreign to his worldview. One of his warriors spoke up for the first time, asking the same question in different words. In Vortan culture, showing mercy to the weak was acceptable, but helping someone who had challenged you made no sense at all. Maya Rodriguez answered before Jake could speak. She explained that humanity had learned some hard lessons during their early expansion into space, When Earth first achieved faster-than-light travel and realized how crowded the galaxy actually was, there had been panic and despair. Some people wanted to hide and pretend they had never left their solar system. Others advocated for aggressive military expansion to claim territory before other species could. The result was nearly a decade of social chaos that almost destroyed human civilization from within. The communications officer continued her story, describing how the Centauri Alliance had intervened during humanity's darkest period. The Centauri were an ancient species that had been exploring the galaxy for over 50,000 years. They had seen countless younger civilizations go through similar crises when they discovered they were not alone in the universe. Instead of conquering Earth or ignoring humanity's struggle, the Centauri had offered guidance and friendship. Danny Wright pulled up historical records showing the first meetings between humans and Centauri. The images showed human diplomats looking shell-shocked and overwhelmed, meeting with patient alien mentors who had helped them understand that being small in a big universe was not something to fear. The Centauri had shared technology, introduced humans to other friendly species, and most importantly taught them that cooperation was more valuable than conquest. Greg Hamilton added his perspective as someone who had served in Earth's military before joining the exploration service. He explained that the human race had come very close to fragmenting into warring factions during that crisis period. Different nations and colonies had different ideas about how to respond to the discovery of alien civilizations. The only thing that prevented outright war was the example set by the Centauri and other peaceful species, who showed that there was another way forward. Helen Carter brought the conversation back to the present situation. She suggested that humanity was now in a position to offer the Vortans the same kind of help that the Centauri had once given to humans. It was not about being superior or showing mercy to inferiors. It was about recognizing that every civilization went through difficult transitions, and having someone to guide you through those moments made all the difference. Captain Jake Morrison finally spoke after listening to his crew make the case better than he could have himself. He told Ambassador Zexoth that the initial laughter on the bridge had not been meant as mockery, though he understood why it felt that way. The humans had laughed because the situation was absurd, not because they thought the Vortans were stupid or worthless. The absurdity came from the gap between Vortan perception and reality, a gap that could be bridged with time and patience. The captain made a formal proposal. The Wanderer and the rest of the exploration fleet would escort the Vortan delegation back to their empire. Along the way, human engineers would work with Vortan crews to upgrade their faster-than-light drives and other systems. More importantly, they would talk and share stories and gradually introduce the Vortans to the reality of galactic civilization. When they arrived at the Vortan homeworld, Jake would personally meet with the Imperial Council to discuss membership in the Stellar Commonwealth. Ambassador Zexoth's eye stalks waved in patterns that the humans had learned to recognize as deep thought, mixed with hope and fear. He asked what membership in the Stellar Commonwealth would actually mean for his people. Would they have to give up their identity and culture? Would they be punished for their past conquests? Would they be relegated to some inferior status among the more advanced civilizations? Sophie explained that the Stellar Commonwealth was not a government that ruled over its members. It was more like a mutual cooperation agreement, where each species maintained their sovereignty while agreeing to certain basic principles. Members pledged not to attack each other, to respect territorial boundaries, to engage in fair trade, and to help each other during emergencies. Beyond those basic rules, each civilization was free to govern itself however it wanted. Claire Bennett pulled up the Commonwealth Charter and displayed it for everyone to read. The document was surprisingly short and straightforward. There were provisions for resolving disputes through mediation rather than violence. There were agreements about sharing scientific knowledge and cultural exchanges. There were protocols for how to handle first contact with new species. Nowhere in the Charter did it say anything about punishment for past actions or requirements to abandon cultural traditions. Danny pointed out one section that he thought would interest the Vortans. Member species were encouraged to maintain their own military forces for self-defense and to help with Commonwealth security operations when needed. The warrior caste would not become obsolete or irrelevant. Instead, they would have the opportunity to serve in a larger context, protecting not just Vortan interests but the security of hundreds of species. Leo added that the technology sharing worked both ways. While the Vortons would obviously benefit from access to more advanced systems, humanity and other species might learn things from Vorton engineers as well. Sometimes isolation led to unique innovations that more connected civilizations never discovered. The Vorton approach to energy shielding, for example, was different from anything in the human database and might have applications that no one had considered yet. Ambassador Zexoth turned to his warriors and spoke in their own language for several minutes. The humans waited patiently while the Vortons debated among themselves. Finally, the ambassador turned back to Jake and said something that surprised everyone.
He admitted that he and many other Vortons had suspected for years that something was wrong with their empire's philosophy.
The ease with which they conquered primitive worlds had never felt like a real test of their supposed superiority. Deep down, many Vortons had wondered if they were simply bullying the weak rather than proving their strength. One of the Vorton warriors removed his ceremonial helmet and spoke directly to Greg Hamilton. He said that he had always been troubled by the idea of conquering species that could not fight back on equal terms. There was no honor in such victories, no real test of courage or skill. He asked if the Stellar Commonwealth had any conflicts that required actual warriors, rather than just soldiers overwhelming primitives with superior technology. Greg smiled and explained that while the Commonwealth preferred peace, there were occasional threats that required military response. Pirates who preyed on trade routes, rogue artificial intelligences that had escaped containment, ancient automated defense systems left behind by extinct civilizations, and occasional aggressive species that refused diplomatic contact. These were real dangers that required skilled warriors to address, and the Commonwealth was always looking for capable military personnel to help protect member species. Jake watched as hope began to replace despair on the Vorton faces. The ambassador was starting to see a path forward for his people, one that did not require abandoning everything they valued, but instead redirected those values toward more constructive purposes. The warrior caste could still be warriors, but they would fight real threats instead of helpless primitives. The empire could still expand, but through colonization of empty worlds rather than conquest of inhabited ones. Helen Carter suggested they seal this agreement with a formal ceremony that would be meaningful to both humans and Vortans. Ambassador Zexoth agreed enthusiastically and proposed a ritual that involved sharing food and drink while making pledges of friendship. The humans thought this sounded perfectly reasonable, and everyone returned to the mess hall where Marcus Johnson quickly prepared another feast. During the meal, Ambassador Zexoth made a confession that explained a lot about the Vortan psychology. He said that his people had been lonely for thousands of years, expanding through space and finding only primitive life or empty worlds. They had built their empire partly from a desire to find someone, anyone who could understand them and speak with them as equals. When that never happened, they convinced themselves that they were meant to be alone at the top, rulers of everything they surveyed. Maya responded that loneliness made people do strange things, and civilizations were no different. Humanity had been fortunate to encounter friendly species early in their space exploration. The Vortans had been unlucky, finding only silence and primitives until they internalized that isolation as superiority. But now that isolation was ending, and the Vortan people could finally join the larger community they had been missing all along. The evening ended with Ambassador Zexoth and Captain Morrison standing together on the observation deck, looking out at the stars while the rest of their crews mingled and talked. The ambassador asked Jake one final question. He wanted to know if the captain really believed that in 5 years, they would look back on this moment and laugh. Jake considered the question seriously before answering. He said that yes, he believed they would laugh, but not because the situation was funny. They would laugh because laughter was how people released tension and celebrated unexpected joy. The Vortans had come expecting to conquer and had found friends instead. Humanity had expected routine survey work and had gained an opportunity to help another species find their place in the galaxy. Sometimes the universe surprised you in the best possible way, and the only appropriate response was to laugh and be grateful.